Hi, in this tutorial we're going to be making this next component. This is a click counter. It's got two buttons, an increment button. If you click this value here increments, and if you click clear, then the value disappears. Now there's an official ServiceNow tutorial which I will link to in the description, which is the counter example. The problem with this tutorial though is that some steps seem outdated. Some of the steps in between they assume you know, and some are just mistakes like this. So it's not completely evident how to complete this tutorial, so that's why I thought I would do this video. And I've also written a blog post that accompanies this video, which is this one, creating a counter at jessems.com. And here, during this video, we'll just be going through the steps that are listed out here. So let's get to it. So step one is setting up the project. So we need a clean directory. So let's start with that. So let's open a new window. You can close this old one. Using Visual Studio Code, open a new folder. So I've got development going on, and then I've got a folder for ServiceNow videos. Let's call it video counter. Okay. So it's going to open that folder for us. And so next, let's also open a terminal so we can follow some of these commands. And then let's go back to the steps, and it says SNC UI component project. So this is to scaffold a new project. It's got some flags here, some parameters, and we can use those to set some parameters on our project. So we'll type that in like this. Let me just change some of these. So my connection profile is personal dev. If you're wondering how to set up your connection profile, you can see an earlier post of mine setting up your development environment. Here, the convention seems to be to put your company there and then put in a component name here. So what did we call this? Let's call it video counter. Description, a counter. That is fine. So let's press enter and hope that works. So what this does, it just creates the skeleton for your project. It communicates with your instance that you should have set up with your connection settings, and here it's got a skeleton going on. Now that we have the skeleton, we've got various dependencies here in the package.json, but they're not on the machine yet. We can ignore these warnings, hopefully. They don't have to do with this necessarily. But these packages we need to actually install, and we do that by just saying npm install. So let's wait for that to complete. All right, that took a while, but we've installed all the packages successfully. There were no major errors. And before we move on, I just want to highlight one of the differences between my instructions. So we've got this command that we just ran, SNC UI component project, with these flags, and what the official tutorial tells us to do, which is now CLI project. So I suspect that's an old command that no longer works, but just to highlight some of the differences. All right, npm install we did. And then what we're going to do is run the component. So there's nothing in the component, so if we run it, it should just give us an empty screen. But that's a good place to for us to start. It has some messages here that it sort of seems like it's complaining, but in the end, it just tends to work. So I've not given those much weight. So here it tells us where the project is running. So if you do control click on Windows or command click on Mac, you can just click that and open it. And here we've got our empty component. So this is sort of our starting point. Right. So then the next step is to define the UI. So as you can see, if we go to our source directory, we go to our video counter and then our index, this is where our component lives. And as you see here, in this render return function, there's not much going on here. That's why there's an empty screen. If, however, we add this, we'll be adding something. I'll save it, it reformats, and we can open that back up and it refreshed itself. So we've got two buttons here, click counter and a value. They don't do anything, but it's there. So that's just the UI elements are there now for us. So we can go to the next step. There's a, by the way, disclaimer here in the official docs. So if we go there, where is it? Disclaimer. In the example, we use the native button tag rather than the now button component. In a component designated for production, you would import and utilize now design system components. So they're saying they're using just a basic HTML component instead of some fancier now component because it's easier to demonstrate. What's a little bit confusing, by the way, is that they say now component, but it's the next experience. So I get confused with all their naming conventions. Seems like they have too many sometimes. Anyway, so step 3 already, making the button interactive or the counter interactive. So to do that, we need to introduce some state. So we do that by adding this. So we just add an initial state property to this object that we're passing to the create custom element function call, which happens at the end of our view. See here, create custom element, we got X, some number, and then we got the name of our component, and we've got some properties here that are defined. If you click enter here, initial state, it even auto-completes for us, and here we can create some initial state. This autofill that you see here, that's actually GitHub Copilot. Let me just try and turn that off. I forget where it is. There we go. Disable globally. Okay, initial start. So we got this tally property and we want to set that to 0. Let's see, are there any other steps? And then we want to destructure that from the state variable. So what that means is we're passing the state variable out of the box here. But in order to access the tally property on that state, we use something that's only available in modern JavaScript. This would not work on the server side with ServiceNow. But what we do is this. So basically what we're saying is, and somehow that's wrong. Let's see what it says. Oh, that's right. It's probably like a constant here. Right. So what it's saying is state is an object, so this is also an object, but I'm only interested in one property and assign that a const, and that's basically what destructuring does. It allows you to sort of pull out a select amount of properties from that object. So if we do that, and then we can use this template to print the tally, which we do this with curly braces, put it in there. What we should see is we should see that initial value come into the component and be set to the value. So let's go check the component, and there we go, value null. So that's working. The only challenge here is that, or the only problem is that it's still not interactive. So to make it interactive, what we actually need to do is make these buttons do something to the state. So there's a built-in directive, or sorry, a attribute on click, which we can use to invoke a function. And there's a function that we pass into the component, update state. So if we were to do this, and then we were passing a new state object, which would be tally +1, see, so it's just a new version of this object down here, this one. this won't do what we want, because what will happen is that every time that this component gets parsed or gets updated, which will be multiple times per second, that's just the way this framework works, it's going to run this, because it's looking for the definition of onClick, and the definition of onClick is the execution of this function. So if we save this, I'll show you what I mean. This is what I mean. So this is not what we want. So to prevent that from happening, what we need to do is actually create a function which returns this function. So this is just a shortcode for a function. It's called the arrow notation, and it basically says create a function, and the return of that function should be this other function. So what happens is that when this component reloads, it executes this, but then it has this as output without executing it, and it only executes this once the user presses onClick. So that should work for the increment. Great. Now let's do a similar thing for clear. So that's also onClick. That's also an arrow function like this. Also returns update state. Also returns a new state object, but here tally is 0. All right. So increment, 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 clear. That works. Okay, great. So I think our component is almost ready to ship to production. The official guidelines, official tutorial, they also have some basic styling that we can add. When you scaffold this project, there's a styles.css file, and you can just plug it in there. You don't need to create a separate file. This gets pulled in automatically. If we then look at our component again, it looks still pretty ugly, if you ask me, but slightly nicer, I guess. And that completes the official tutorial. What's left is for us to ship this to production. So we can press Control or Command C to end this live server, and we got access to the terminal again. And then I forget what the command is to ship. Oh, that reminds me. Let's update the name of this component, because it doesn't do this for you automatically. It calls it my component, and if you don't update this, then you'll have thousands of my component in your component list in UI Builder. So let's call this video counter, because this is a video. Description we can leave like that. Okay, let's look up what the command is to deploy this thing. So it's snc UI component deploy. Let's see if that works. Looks like it's working. All right, great. That looks like it was successful. So what we can do now is go to my personal dev instance. Let's go to UI Builder. I've got a test experience somewhere here. Let's wait for it to load. There we go, test. So we can add a component here, type in video, we got video counter. There we go, we can save that, open it. And here we've got our working component on our instance.